From Ivy League dreams to dirty pipes, the Daniel Whitaker story. Daniel Whitaker was born into comfort but not wealth. The kind of comfort that came from discipline. The kind of comfort that didn't announce itself, didn't decorate itself, didn't apologize for itself either. It simply existed, quietly, the way a well-built house exists, unnoticed until you tried to live in something less. His father, Thomas Whitaker, woke up every day at 5:30 a.m. Not because he had to, not because some boss demanded it, not because his calendar was overflowing with urgent meetings, but because that's what he had always done. Coffee, newspaper, numbers, quiet. The same 4 steps, the same chair, the same window where the morning sun cut a slow line across the kitchen floor. An accountant by trade, a builder by nature. He didn't build things with hammers. He built them with margins, with patience, with the kind of dependable repetition that quietly makes a life. Clients trusted him because he didn't sell. He didn't pitch. He just did the work, and the work spoke. His mother, Elaine Whitaker, worked in education. Patient, thoughtful. The kind of woman who could explain something complicated in a way that made it feel simple, and never made you feel small for not having understood it the first time. She taught middle school English. She had been doing it for 23 years. She still kept the first thank you note a student ever wrote her, folded inside her desk drawer, the corners soft from being touched too often. They weren't flashy. They weren't loud. They drove sensible cars. They paid off their mortgage 2 years early and didn't tell anyone. They went on 1 vacation a year and came back tan and unbothered. But they had something Daniel would later realize he didn't understand at all: perspective. Early signs Daniel didn't struggle the way other kids did. By the time he was 7, he was reading above grade level. Not just a little, multiple grades ahead. He'd ask questions at dinner that made his parents put their forks down. By 10, teachers were pulling Thomas and Elaine aside at parent-teacher conferences and using a particular word in a particular tone. He's exceptional. It was always said with a small smile, a kind of half-warning, half-celebration, as if the teacher knew something about exceptional children that the parents would eventually have to learn the hard way. At first, Thomas and Elaine handled it carefully. Being smart is a gift, his mother would say, kneeling down so they were eye to eye. But character is a choice. Daniel nodded. He always nodded. But he didn't hear it. Not really. The words went into the same place all parental lectures go. Somewhere shallow, somewhere temporary, somewhere already half forgotten by bedtime. The first shift. The shift didn't come from success. It came from comparison. There was a boy in his class named Marcus. Marcus had a quiet face and serious eyes. He carried his backpack with both straps. He raised his hand even when he wasn't sure of the answer, especially when he wasn't sure. He was the kind of kid who genuinely loved learning, in a way that had nothing to do with grades. Marcus tried hard, studied longer, asked more questions. He stayed after class. He kept neat notebooks with color-coded tabs. He asked the teacher to explain things twice, sometimes 3 times, and never seemed embarrassed about it. But Marcus didn't get the same results. One afternoon, after getting another perfect score on a math test he'd barely glanced at the night before, Daniel was packing up his bag when he overheard 2 teachers talking in the hallway. They didn't see him. "Marcus works harder than anyone in this class," one said. There was real affection in her voice. Real frustration, too. The other replied quietly, "Some kids just have it." Daniel froze for a moment, his hand halfway inside his backpack. He carried that sentence with him for the rest of the day, for the rest of the week, for the rest of his life, though he wouldn't realize it for a long time. Not as a thought, as a truth. And once a child decides something is true, very little in the world can convince him otherwise. The birth of superiority. By middle school, Daniel had begun separating people. Not openly, not aggressively, but internally, with the cold precision of someone organizing files he never intended to share. There were people who had it, and people who didn't. And once you decided who belonged where, something dangerous happened. It became very easy to justify how you treated them. Not cruelly. He was never cruel. Cruelty would have required noticing them. It was more subtle than that. He simply didn't extend himself. He didn't offer help on group projects. He didn't slow down his answers in class so others could follow. He didn't pretend to be impressed by things he wasn't impressed by. In his head, he wasn't being arrogant. He was just being honest. That's the thing about superiority. It never feels like superiority from the inside. It feels like clarity. The dinner table divide. At dinner one night, when Daniel was 13, his father mentioned a client. A plumber, Thomas said, reaching for the salt. Runs his own business. 3 trucks now. Smart guy. Makes good money. Better than most of the office workers I do returns for. Daniel barely looked up from his plate. A plumber? His father paused. There was something in the way Daniel had said it, the particular shape of the question, that made him slowly set down the salt. Yes, Daniel smirked slightly. A small thing, almost imperceptible. The kind of expression a teenager makes when he thinks he's being clever and adult. I mean, good for him, I guess. The table went quiet. His mother set down her water glass with deliberate softness, the way she did when she was choosing her words. What do you mean by that? Daniel shrugged. The shrug of someone who already regretted speaking, but wasn't quite mature enough to say so. I'm just saying, it's not exactly, No, his father said, setting down his fork. His voice wasn't angry. That was worse, somehow. It was disappointed. I don't know. Daniel didn't respond. He stared at his plate. The chicken, the potatoes, the carrots his mother had cooked the way he liked them. But something had been revealed. And his father, who had spent 20 years reading between the lines of other people's finances, watching how small assumptions become large patterns, saw it clearly. He saw it the way an accountant sees an error on page 3 that's going to cost someone everything by page 30. He didn't say anything else that night, but he stayed up later than usual. High school. The identity hardens. By high school, Daniel had perfected the image. He spoke carefully, moved deliberately, carried himself like someone already accomplished, like someone whose future had already been written and who was simply waiting for the world to catch up to it. He wore button-downs when other kids wore hoodies. He brought a leather notebook to class. He used words like trajectory and optimize and asymmetric in conversations that did not require them. He wasn't arrogant in the loud, obnoxious way. He was worse. He was quietly dismissive. The kind of person who didn't argue, because he didn't believe you were worth arguing with. Who responded to disagreement with a small, polite smile that said, I see why you would think that, and you'll understand someday. Girls noticed him. Some were drawn in. Most kept their distance. They couldn't quite explain why, but something about him felt like talking to a closed door painted to look like an open one. Teachers liked his work, but rarely liked him. And Daniel, measuring his life in grades, awards, and acceptances, interpreted all of this as confirmation that he was simply ahead of everyone else. The guidance counselor during senior year, Daniel sat across from his guidance counselor, Mrs. Alvarez. Her office was small and warm, full of the soft chaos of someone who actually used her space. Student artwork pinned crookedly to the corkboard, a mug that read, World's Okayest Counselor, a half-eaten granola bar on a napkin beside her keyboard. And Daniel, measuring his life in grades, awards, and acceptances, interpreted all of this as confirmation that he was simply ahead of everyone else. She had seen students like him before, brilliant, driven, and just slightly disconnected from reality, the way a kite is connected to its string only by a thread and only when the wind is gentle. "You have excellent options," she said, sliding a list across the desk. "Ivy League, top engineering programs, a couple of full ride offers from state schools that I'd seriously encourage you to consider, by the way." Daniel scanned the paper like he already knew what it said. He probably did. "I'll probably go engineering," he said. "Something technical, high level." Mrs. Alvarez nodded slowly. She'd written a recommendation letter for him 3 weeks ago. It had been hard to write, not because she didn't have anything good to say, but because she had to dig past the polish to find it. "And what do you want your life to look like?" Daniel didn't hesitate. High income, influence, impact. It came out smooth, rehearsed. 3 syllables, 3 syllables, 2 syllables, like a campaign slogan. She studied him for a moment. Impact on who? Daniel paused. It was the first question he didn't answer immediately, the first question whose answer he had not, somewhere along the way, prepared in advance. Mrs. Alvarez didn't push. She just waited, the way good teachers wait, patient, unhurried, leaving the silence open like a door. Eventually he said, "On, things that matter." She nodded once and made a small note in his file. He didn't see what she wrote. College. Confirmation. Daniel got into a top-tier engineering school, not Ivy League, but close enough to carry weight at dinner parties. Close enough that the sweatshirt, when he wore at home over winter break, was recognized at the airport, the gas station, the grocery store. He majored in engineering, excelled, graduated with honors, stacked his resume with internships, projects, certifications. A summer at a top consulting firm, a semester abroad in Zurich, a research position with a professor whose name appeared in places that mattered. By all traditional measures, he had done everything right, and in the language of the world he believed in, that was supposed to be enough. The echo chamber. In college, no one challenged Daniel's worldview. In fact, they amplified it. Late-night conversations in dorm rooms and library corners and overpriced coffee shops, all circling the same 3 planets: optimizing careers, maximizing earning potential, leveraging skill sets. They spoke about life the way analysts speak about a stock: efficient, strategic, quantified. They congratulated each other for not being like those people, the people who hadn't optimized, who hadn't planned, who hadn't grasped the scale of their own ambitions. It all sounded impressive, and it all sounded detached. None of them had ever fixed anything that broke. None of them had ever built anything you could touch. They had built spreadsheets and strategies and decks. And spreadsheets and strategies and decks had built their idea of who they were. The graduation moment. 4 years later, Daniel walked across the stage. Honors, engineering degree, perfect trajectory. As he shook hands and smiled for photos, his father stood in the crowd, in a suit that was a little too warm for the day, holding a program he had folded and refolded so many times the crease had begun to tear. Proud, but thoughtful, because he knew something Daniel didn't. The world doesn't reward potential. It rewards value. Potential is what gets you in the door. Value is what keeps you in the room. And value, Thomas had learned, has very little to do with where you went to school and a great deal to do with what you can actually do when no one is grading you anymore. The market that didn't care. Daniel graduated into a world that had shifted. Artificial intelligence had begun replacing entry-level technical work, the very rungs of the ladder he had been trained to climb. The internships that used to lead to offers had dried up. Junior roles had quietly evaporated. Companies that had hired 40 engineers a year were hiring 4, then 2, then none. Positions were fewer, competition was higher, and suddenly being exceptional wasn't enough. Because the market was full of exceptional. The internet had made exceptional cheap. There were 18-year-olds in Lagos and Lima and Lahore writing code that ran circles around half of his graduating class, and they were doing it for a fifth of the price. Rejection, in phases. The first rejection didn't bother him. Thank you for your application. Generic, expected. He moved on. He even mentioned it to a friend with a small, knowing laugh, like a man brushing lint off a sleeve. The 10th rejection was still fine. Just a numbers game, he told himself, refreshing his inbox at 11 p.m. The 50th rejection was annoying. He started skimming the emails instead of reading them. He started recognizing the templates. He learned which companies sent rejections at exactly 6:47 a.m. on Tuesdays. The 100th rejection was confusing. He read every line of his resume again. He had it reviewed by 3 different career coaches. He paid one of them $400 for advice that, on reflection, sounded a lot like what Mrs. Alvarez had said for free. And then came the silence. The silence. What hurt wasn't the rejection, it was the silence. Applications that went nowhere. Interviews that ended politely. Recruiters who replied to one email and never the next. We've decided to move forward with other candidates. No explanation, no feedback, no path forward. He started measuring his days in open tabs and unread responses. He stopped opening his curtains in the morning. His apartment slowly filled with the small evidence of a life on hold. Laundry he kept meaning to do. Dishes he kept meaning to wash. Calls home he kept meaning to return. The silence wasn't just from companies. The silence was inside him, too. Because for the first time in his life, he was waiting for the world to confirm something about himself, and the world was refusing. The dinner table again. Back home, things were quieter. He had moved back into his childhood bedroom, just temporarily, he kept saying, the way everyone says it. The posters were gone. The desk was the same. The bed was a foot too short for him now. His mother still asked gently, "How's the search going?" "Fine." It wasn't. She knew it wasn't. She didn't push. She just made his favorite meals more often than usual and pretended not to notice that he sometimes barely touched them. His father said less now. He'd come home from the office, hang up his coat, eat dinner, and read in the living room. He didn't lecture. He didn't suggest. He didn't ask Daniel to consider backup options. But one night, he spoke. "You ever think about other options?" Daniel's jaw tightened. He felt heat rise in his neck, the way it had at 13, at the dinner table, when his father had mentioned the plumber. "I didn't work this hard for other options." His father nodded slowly. He didn't argue. He just looked at his son for a long moment, the way he might look at a balance sheet that almost reconciled, but didn't. Sometimes the work isn't about where you end up. Daniel didn't respond, but the sentence stayed with him. It sat in the corner of his mind for days, refusing to be filed. The breaking point. 2 years. 2 full years. That's how long it took for the identity Daniel had built to crack, not shatter. Not yet, just crack. The way a windshield cracks under a small, persistent stone, slowly at first, almost invisibly, until one morning the line stretches all the way across the glass and you can't unsee it. He turned 25 in his old bedroom. His parents took him out for dinner. He smiled in the photos. He looked at the photos later and didn't recognize himself. The search that changed everything. It started late at night, scrolling, restless, frustrated. It was 1:14 a.m. He had been awake for 19 hours. He'd already refreshed his email twice in the last 3 minutes. He typed something he never thought he would type. Careers that are in demand. Then, trade job salary. Then, and his hand actually paused over the keyboard for a moment, as if his old self was making one last argument against it, plumbing apprenticeship near me. He stared at the screen. Longer than he expected. Because somewhere underneath the embarrassment, underneath the resistance, underneath the voice that sounded a lot like his 13-year-old self at the dinner table, there was something else. Curiosity. And for the first time in 2 years, the small, quiet, almost forgotten feeling of a door. The first day. The job site was loud, messy, unpredictable, nothing like the controlled environments Daniel was used to. There was no fluorescent hum, no ergonomic chair, no second monitor. There was concrete dust, the smell of cut copper, country music playing too loud from someone's paint-spattered radio, and a coffee thermos balanced on a stack of 2x4s. Rick was the foreman, mid-50s, gray at the temples, hands like worn leather. He didn't ask Daniel about his degree. He didn't ask about his GPA or his internships or whether he had ever lived abroad. Rick handed him a wrench. Let's see what you can do. No resume, no credentials, just action. Daniel took the wrench. It was heavier than he had expected. It was honest in a way that nothing on his resume had ever been. The moment of humility. It happened in a small bathroom on the second floor of a house that smelled, frankly, terrible. A clogged system, a mess, a situation no one wanted to deal with. The kind of situation that, 3 years earlier, Daniel would have hired someone like Rick to handle and felt vaguely superior about the transaction. Rick stepped back. "You're up." Daniel froze. Everything in his old identity resisted. Every neuron of every late-night dorm conversation, every ivy-adjacent sweatshirt, every leather notebook he had ever carried into a classroom screamed, "This isn't me." But reality didn't care who he thought he was. Reality cared whether the pipe got cleared, and the pipe didn't know about his GPA. So he knelt down, he breathed through his mouth, he picked up the tool, and he did the work. It was disgusting. It was humbling. It was also, and this part surprised him, strangely satisfying. Because at the end of it, the pipe ran clear. There was no peer review, no subjective evaluation, no, we've decided to move forward with other candidates. There was a clog, and then there wasn't. The work that changes you. The first weeks were brutal, physically. His back hurt in places he hadn't known had places. His hands developed blisters, then calluses, then a kind of permanent roughness he eventually stopped noticing. Mentally, he had to relearn how to learn. He had spent 4 years learning from textbooks and lectures and slide decks. Now he was learning from a man who pointed at things and grunted, and who expected you to figure out the rest, emotionally. There were moments, bent under a sink, soaked, tired, smelling like things he didn't want to think about, where the old Daniel would whisper in the back of his head, "This isn't who you were supposed to be." But something started to shift, not outside, inside. Because for the first time in his life, his self-worth was not coming from a grade, not from a logo on a sweatshirt, not from a recruiter's email, not from anyone else's opinion of him. It was coming from a pipe that didn't leak anymore, from a sink that drained, from a homeowner who said thank you and meant it, from his own 2 hands. Rick's lesson 1. One day, about 4 months in, Rick looked at him and said, "You think too much." Daniel frowned. He had been mid-explanation about pressure dynamics, something he'd half remembered from a fluid mechanics class, something he was rather proud of bringing up. "What do you mean?" Rick pointed at the pipe. "It's simple. It's either working or it's not. Fix it." Daniel stared at it. For once, there was no theory to hide behind, no framework, no optimization model, no abstraction. Just a pipe, just a problem, just his hands. And he realized, slowly, that this was a kind of intelligence too. Not lower than the one he had been trained in, just different. The intelligence of contact, of consequence, of doing. He had spent 22 years admiring the map. Rick was teaching him the territory. Respect, earned over time. Daniel got better, faster, more precise. He started seeing problems before Rick pointed them out. He started anticipating which fitting would be needed before reaching for the bag. He started, in small ways, to feel something he had never felt during 4 years of academic excellence: pride that didn't need an audience. And something he had never experienced before began to happen. People respected him. Not because of where he went to school, not because of how he spoke, not because of the careful, deliberate way he carried himself, but because of what he could do. A homeowner with a flooded basement at 2 a.m. doesn't care about your GPA. A retired teacher with a leaking water heater doesn't ask where you studied. They just want the problem solved. And when you solve it, really solve it, cleanly, kindly, without making them feel stupid for not knowing, they look at you the way no professor ever did. They look at you like you saved their day, because in a small but real way, you did. The new identity Daniel didn't become someone else, he became someone real. The polish was still there, but it had been sanded into something useful. The intelligence was still there, but it had been put to work. The ambition was still there, but it had been redirected towards something he could actually hold in his hands. He stopped speaking in optimizations and started speaking in details. He stopped measuring his days in interviews and started measuring them in jobs completed. He stopped checking his email at midnight. He slept better. He ate more. He laughed in a way he hadn't laughed since he was a child, loud, unguarded, ungroomed. The business years later, when he started his own company, he did things differently. He paid his workers well, better than the industry standard, even when it stung the margins. He listened to them. He asked for their opinions on bids, on tools, on customers. He remembered their kids' names. He respected them, not as a management technique, but because he had been them, and he knew what it had cost him to learn what they already knew. When a young apprentice showed up on his first day, nervous, overdressed, holding a wrench like it was a foreign object, Daniel didn't smirk. He didn't make a comment about it later in the truck. He just said, "You'll get the hang of it. Everyone does." And he meant it, because he understood something now. Skill has no hierarchy. Only application does. The final scene. One evening, Daniel stood outside a home after finishing a job. The sun was setting, that particular kind of late afternoon gold that turns everything ordinary into a postcard. The kind of light his mother would have stopped to point out when he was 7, and he would have been too busy reading to look up. His hands were dirty, his clothes worn. His truck, paid for, with his name and his number on the side, sat at the curb behind him. But his mind was clear. It had been clear for a long time now. He had not realized, in his old life, just how loud his mind had always been. How much of his thinking had been performance. How much of his ambition had been anxiety in a nicer suit. His phone buzzed. A message from an old college classmate, one of the late-night dorm room optimizers, one of the boys who had spoken about life like a stock chart. "Hey man, still looking. Market's rough." Daniel looked at the message, then at his truck, his tools, his business, his life. He thought about Marcus. He thought about Mrs. Alvarez and her question, impact on who and how? For years, he hadn't had a real answer. He thought about his father, sitting at the kitchen table with the morning paper, saying nothing, knowing everything. He thought about Rick, who had handed him a wrench and changed his life without ever giving a speech. He typed back, "Yeah, I know," then paused and added, "Let me know if you ever want to try something different." Final line. The life he thought he deserved was never the one that would fulfill him, and the work he once looked down on became the foundation of everything he built. Because dignity, it turns out, was never about the kind of work you do. It was always about how honestly you did it.